The world of collegiate athletics has shifted drastically over the last several years. The winding road of what amateurism looks like and how it's defined didn't begin with name, image, and likeness. This journey began a long, long time ago, before any of today's current student athletes and many administrators were even born. uNILateral Decisions is a new show that focuses on the legal issues shaping modern-day college athletics. But before we can start to dissect professional athletes returning to college, eligibility lawsuits, or broken NIL contracts, we need to answer one question. How exactly did we get here? I'm Dominic Shelden, and alongside former college athletics administrators Joe Nickell and Mike Walsh, as well as sports legal expert and Professor Sam Ehrlich, we find out just how we got where we are today. Focus first on the 1984 case, NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new show, uNILateral Decisions. My name's Dominic Shelden. So I want to go back to the 1980s, at a time even before Mike Walsh was born. But college athletics in the broadcasting world was so different. So, Mike, at one point in time, colleges were more concerned with losing ticket sales. So there was a concern on having too many games broadcasted. So what was the broadcast landscape of college athletics, particularly football, like in the 70s, early 80s?
Sure. So even before then, extremely limited, really at an Ivy League institution where it started with Penn and their ability to broadcast local stations. And that just kind of snowballed into what's possible. What can we do? How can we get more exposure? And the NCAA was very concerned, and many of their member institutions were very concerned about what's the impact of that? What is the impact on the live experience, the in-venue experience? And commissioned some studies and determined that, they really felt that restricting the amount of broadcasts and the frequency with which a certain team would be broadcast during a year was the best for the organization and its membership. And so fast forward, into the late 70s, early 80s, and there's a lot of schools wondering, why can't we get a bigger piece of this? Why can't we get more exposure out of this? And challenging what that looked like. And, I'll kind of leave really the legal component of it to Sam, certainly after we hear his background, but just the idea that the biggest schools wanted a bigger piece of the pie. It's really what it came down to. And the concept of, does the NCAA have the right to restrict that essentially trade? And the economic component of it, the frequency of how often they were put out, the price fixing, a lot of the same things we hear about today. It really was the start of that. And so a couple of schools stepped up and said, we're going to challenge this in court. And that challenge, again, we're still feeling it today, over 40 years later, to try to figure out, what does the NCAA actually have, the ability to rule with an iron fist on, versus which rulings have they made that we sit here and talk about unilateral decisions. That's a lot of what they did. And it's coming back to haunt them still, even 40 years later. And sometimes they continue to make those decisions despite the Supreme Court ruling in the 80s around this one topic of, you really can't make that decision for everybody else, especially those who are going to be impacted by it and don't have a say in it. And yet they've continued to do that. And so here we are today.
So, Sam, we'll get into that 1984 NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. How did that fundamentally shift, and why did that shift how broadcasts and schools handled those rights?
Yeah, and what the Supreme Court decided, and this was they had affirmed the Court of Appeals decision and the district court decision, kind of all the way down the line. You had these court decisions saying that the NCAA's restriction of the output of college sports violates antitrust law. Antitrust law being kind of the idea that we need to have a free market, that free market competition needs to be protected. Where if Joe and Mike are trying to each sell me a product, they're competing for my dollars. They're going to lower prices or raise quality or both in order to get me to purchase their product instead of the other product. But the NCAA, the antitrust theory was, all these schools came together and collectively colluded to restrict the output and to the harm of consumers. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court found. The Supreme Court found that, yes, there are pro-competitive benefits here. Antitrust law is all about weighing the anti-competitive harm versus the pro-competitive benefits. There are pro-competitive benefits here, but they just weren't convinced that restricting output of television is really, really kind of fosters those benefits. They didn't really see kind of the connection between there, and it just didn't seem like something that they were really going to buy. But what was really interesting about Board of Regents, it was kind of a two-part decision in a certain way. Didn't really feel like it. Like, if you read the decision itself, it doesn't really feel like it. But the impact kind of went in two very different directions. one direction is that the NCAA cannot restrict television output. They have to allow schools like, the plaintiffs in this case for the University of Oklahoma and the University of Georgia, you have to allow those two schools or the conferences that they then create to be able to sell television rights on their own. And you can't have kind of one big organization kind of restricting the output. But at the same time, and this gets to the pro-competitive benefits here and the connection that the Supreme Court did not see with the television deals, they still did see that there is significant benefit to amateurism in college sports. The closing paragraph of this decision was, there's this revered tradition of amateurism in college sports, and the NCAA needs ample latitude to play that role. And even though they found that these output restrictions do not foster that revered tradition, courts took that and ran with it. And we had 37 years of courts saying, the Supreme Court told us we need to respect this revered tradition of amateurism. We need to give ample latitude to the NCAA to foster this revered tradition of amateurism. And it really led to courts, again, taking it and running with it. And at the same time that television revenue started to explode because you had more output here, college athletes' earnings and kind of their role in it, their ability to kind of profit off of these increased revenues was still tampered down to a scholarship and some ancillary benefits.
So, Joe, from your perspective as an administrator, when we think about those early years leading into the 2000s, 2010s, where broadcast revenue is fundamentally shifting funding for college athletic programs and even universities, how did that money get used by and large, and how much of a change did that spur in overall funding for these departments across the country?
That's a big question. What you saw with the increased revenue was, an investment in athletics, right? Like, your athletic department is the front door to your institution. And so you saw competition amongst conferences. Competition obviously among schools that always existed, but the competition amongst conferences to me was probably, the biggest, I don't want to say fallout, but the biggest domino to fall with this ruling. And they were chasing, money. 40 years later, they're still chasing money. We're still seeing conference realignment. So to me, that it took time. There were some teams that shifted conferences, but what we've seen over the last, 4 or 5 years has been a monumental shift in the landscape. And that's been the biggest domino, chasing money because it became available as a result of this ruling.
So Sam mentioned it earlier, but all this money starts coming to these schools. You're seeing better facilities, improvements, coaches' salaries go up, student athletes not seeing much of that money. Mike, I go to you, and some of the bigger things that people saw in the headlines, you've got Ian Johnson at Boise State crocheting beanies and being told he can't sell his beanies because that's an NCAA violation. You hear Shabazz Napier of UConn talking about going to bed hungry because he doesn't have enough food. What are some of those stories of student athletes maybe not getting equitable treatment for what they're bringing those universities?
Sure. I think Sam's point touched on that a lot, where the sliver of hope that the NCAA and the member institutions to a certain degree were holding on to was the idea of amateurism was not lost within that Supreme Court ruling. So they grasped at it, right? And it's like, how do we continue to ensure that we're running amateur athletics? And certainly, I think in hindsight we can say to its detriment, making those rules about, well, what constitutes amateur? What constitutes too much compensation? What constitutes them, an athlete, being compensated in exchange for what they're producing as an athlete versus who they are as a student, who they are as a person, and what benefit are they gaining by being an athlete that the NCAA, and again, its members, it's not solely an NCAA issue, but its members who voted, what do we really need to make sure, like, this is black and white, this athlete, this person is not gaining a benefit because they are an athlete over their general student body peers who are just a student at the university. And again, hindsight being what it is, but I think when you go back to the decision-making process for those 30 to 40 years about hey, amateurism has been upheld by the court. We need to protect it at all costs. This is going to be our differentiating factor. This is what makes us different. You've got the pro sports model that is what it is, and it has protections through other congressional acts to be able to operate in a little bit more of a pro-competitive balanced situation. And the NCAA knew what it needed to do different was the amateurism piece. And how do you protect it? You make sure that you are not allowing anybody to say that they're not amateurs. And they took it to the fullest extent in a lot of ways. You bring up, going to bed hungry, certain things. The ruling that everybody loves to talk about is like, well, you could get a bagel, but you can't put anything on it, right? I mean, that's the one that in the mid 2000s, 2010s, that was the one that changed, that everybody went, wait a minute, that was a rule? Like on the outside, it just was kind of like, that's crazy, right? And that's where we started to see some of this shift of the cultural acceptance of, does that really make somebody an amateur? Like you're gonna put them through all this training, you're gonna feed them, you're gonna do all these things, and you go to a post-game meal and you can spend whatever you want on them, but yeah, for a snack after the weight room, they can't put peanut butter on their bagel. Like that's actually not amateurism. That's not protecting the model. So, you go back and I think it's that idea, you can understand why they got there. You can understand why that was the most important thing to say, well, let's make sure that nobody can say that they're benefiting from being an athlete versus their university peer who is a student. And so if you look through that lens, I think a lot of the rules you can make sense of. But if you take a step back, and again, the general public after O'Bannon, which we'll get into later, it started to change of like, well, wait, like, and the explosion of revenue, as Joe touched on. And, I think that the schools becoming assets for the conferences, and the conferences had taken the power, the balance had shifted to where the NCAA lost so much power because of that initial Regents ruling. Now the conferences had the power. The conferences were choosing to exert that by picking the schools that they wanted, making it a market-driven decision. And it became very economic. Everything became very economic based to the point where eventually it did become, okay, the athletes can't be the only ones who are not, being looked at as part of this economic picture. And so that's really where it all started to change.
For Sam and Joe, walk me back to this conference realignment stuff in large part due to TV revenue. So Joe, maybe from your perspective first, how do these schools go from potentially having local TV market broadcasts to network televisions, conference agreements? So how do we go from individual schools utilizing their rights locally to national discussion and conferences?
Demand. I mean, it's simply demand. There's a limited supply. I mean, there's only so many games, that can be broadcast, but you go back to the 80s and how many national broadcast outlets we had versus what we have available to us today. I mean, we got conferences broadcasting on the CW. So demand. And as the demand increased, the revenues increased. And competition is what college athletics is. So schools are competing for dollars, conferences are competing for dollars. I mean, every time a conference is renegotiating its TV contract, it's national news and what's going to happen. And, people are looking at kick times and all of these little details, but demand, that's how we got to where we are. My question for Sam, is kind of how, and maybe this is a completely off topic discussion, but like, how did college athletics get to the point where different pieces of the pie were under the NCAA purview and others were not? The CFP is separate, but they've held control of the NCAA basketball tournament. And I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know how we got to that point, but it seems like that is a monumental piece of the financial pie for the NCAA that, had they held on to it, I don't know what looks different today. I really don't.
And I think Mike hit the nail on the head, because after Regents, and I think you can probably pick at that and say, well, they were doing some of this before Regents as well. But after Regents, all of this became very market-based decisions, became very economic decisions. It's all about what can make us the most amount of money. And a lot of times it was us, being the conferences or the individual school instead of the NCAA as a whole. Like, I go back to there was actually a dissent in Board of Regents. Board of Regents was a 72 decision. And the dissent was written by Byron Wizard Wright, who, former NFL draft pick. He was, superstar in college. Probably the Supreme Court justice who has the most kind of subject matter knowledge of college sports is because of his role. And he wrote that, this is incorrect. Like this decision, Board of Regents decision is incorrect because the NCAA is not making economic decisions. They're promoting amateurism. They're, the reason why they have these restrictions on output are to promote kind of the amateur character of college sports. And you could say that this was before Regents, but taking Justice White as word, after Board of Regents, all that changed because now there's so much more access to this money. There's so much more ability to kind of get to this money, and schools, and I think justifiably so, and conferences, I think justifiably so, wanted to maximize their revenue as much as possible, and that's exactly what led to tensions. We'll touch on O'Bannon later, not to kind of jump ahead a little bit, but the video games were the biggest tension point in the early 2010s because you have this dichotomy of college athletes not being able to make money off their name, image, and likeness, but the schools selling their name, image, and likeness to these video game companies for millions of dollars. And, Ed O'Bannon going down and visiting his, watching his cousin play video games and seeing his name, image, and likeness in there and saying, "Oh, I didn't get anything for this. Why is the NCAA allowed to do this?" And like all those tensions kind of led to kind of where we are now. But, to your question, like why doesn't, the NCAA have the CFP? They have the NCAA basketball tournament, but they don't have the CFP. The simple answer is power. It's economic power. It's who wants to control the most profitable aspects of college sports. And the conferences want to kind of retain that control. They have the ability to retain that control. And that's their card. That's their leverage card. And, you hear, these days you hear, constantly about threats of the Big Ten and the SEC kind of leaving to start their own thing. And I think that's what keeps the NCAA kind of at arm's length and it keeps them saying, well, we still need them for the NCAA basketball tournament. So, we're going to kind of do what they want. And you see the creeping kind of taking of power in a lot of ways.
I think there's a component to that too, where even prior to Regents, there was this idea that the NCAA was almost an olive branch or perhaps their way of maintaining some level of competitive balance in the market, not so much among the schools. Their hold on the TV contracts, even at the time, was restricted to regular season competition. And the bowl games, which had, existed well before that, there was always a different component to what the postseason was, and they weren't restricting that. And it was almost as if that was the way that they were going to try to win this case of like, well, we're restricting what's important to us. There's still this other avenue for people to be able to compete. And so, strategic decision or not, which obviously didn't pan out, they kind of had left that alone. They left the postseason alone for the bowl games to be able to have, which obviously, back at that time, we're really about those local markets and how are we having the festivals around whatever the thing may be, right? And that's why they're the Peach Bowl and the Sugar Bowl and everything else that it's local. And it's like, you know what? You get to have that. You get to control what that looks like. That obviously has then been commercialized because it's able to. And so I think that really that was lost even before Regents, but it has exploded because of the decision of Regents.
Absolutely.
It's funny, you touch on O'Bannon, which we'll get into next episode. There's so much to talk about there, but I think back to some of the stories of what are we doing when it comes to utilizing student athletes' name, image, likeness, and giving them no say. They're in college, Super Bowl winner, former Boise State Bronco. He goes across the street to pick up a soda or a water at a gas station. He sees a bobblehead with his face, his name, his number that they're selling for $15 a pop, and he's never heard of it. He did not sign off on anything. And the stories he's got is pretty great. So it has changed in a lot of ways for the best. But I want to go back to just this difference in time from Board of Regents to O'Bannon's case. Why was there such a large gap in time where no one really addressed any of that change that was happening?
Because the courts wouldn't let them. And that goes back to, kind of that second part of the Regents decision that said, the NCAA plays this, there's this really important role in kind of maintaining the revered tradition of amateurism in college sports, and they need ample latitude to play that role. There were a lot of lawsuits. In 1988, you had the McCormick lawsuit. 1992, you had the Banks lawsuit, which is all about, player wanting to come back, after entering the NFL draft, which, kind of sounds interesting in today's landscape. Shout out Charles Bedico. But, you had a bunch of these decisions, but courts were universally saying, well, we have to follow the Supreme Court here. Supreme Court said the NCAA deserves a stamp of latitude to preserve amateurism in college sports. There's really not a lot we can do about that. And it really took until the O'Bannon decision, for one, and even before that, the Hart and Keller decisions, which weren't antitrust decisions, but they were intellectual property decisions, to really kind of pick at that facade and really for courts to say, things have kind of changed since 1984. We have a lot more revenue here. We have a lot more things here. And even like the Ninth Circuit and the O'Bannon decision, which we'll kind of talk about, was like, maybe the Supreme Court didn't mean for us to kind of give this blanket kind of quasi antitrust exemption in this case. But again, it took them until 2015 with the O'Bannon decision, or 2014 with, I guess, Judge Wilkins' district court decision in that case, for courts to really say, you know what, maybe this isn't exactly what the Supreme Court wanted us to do. But you have, like, I think it's kind of a misnomer to say that there weren't any challenges kind of leading up to O'Bannon, because there were a lot of challenges. There's a lot of these cases that really kind of picked at the amateurism system. I think the best illustration, for example, is in 2008, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in a case called Bassett v. NCAA. It's a case about football coach who was punished for allegedly paying players under the table, and he filed an antitrust lawsuit saying that you're keeping me out of this market. This is a group boycott, and the court said, and you could pick at that all you want, but the court said, well, actually, what the NCAA is doing, antitrust law only applies to commercial markets. It only applies to restraints of commercial markets. What the NCAA doing by taking money out of college sports is actually anti-commercial, which, I mean, you kind of look at the decision and now and be like, I don't know if that's quite right. In fact, the Ninth Circuit in O'Bannon said it was, quote, simply wrong, but that's how courts saw the landscape at that time. And that's why, there weren't really any successful challenges, because the courts, again, they weren't willing to hear it. Which
was somewhat dictated by public discourse.
Oh, of course. Well. Absolutely.
And where the people were, and Joe brought it up too, about, the seismic change, I think, in that public discourse really was Texas and Oklahoma changing conferences, which was a byproduct of the 30 years prior decision that the conferences had the power, that it became market driven, that eventually raced to the bottom in some ways. Because initially, after the ruling in Regents, it did open pricing, and pricing came down in a lot of ways. And so it took time to recorrect and say the demand popped up, the cable television popped up, the streaming services, all the things. It took time for the ecosystem around broadcasting to be able to take on the increased demand. And then it became a race. And then when Texas and Oklahoma leave for the SEC, and everybody says, wait a minute, like that, and that public discourse, how does that impact the legal discourse and how judges view those things, I suppose?
And tremendously, and even beyond kind of all of that. I mean, there's still, at that time, and really kind of until the early to mid 2010s, people, most people, the public at large, was still very much in favor of amateurism in college sports. We've seen a kind of a shift to that end, but there's still a lot of fear, and the NCAA defended O'Bannon, defended all these lawsuits by saying, if we're not amateur anymore, if you take this away from us, people are going to stop watching college sports. And I think, at that time, it was a fair argument, because I think a lot of people, I think the public discourse, again, like you said, Mike, I mean, kind of the public at large was very much in favor of amateur college sports and was very opposed to paying players. But even before Texas and Oklahoma, I really think the video games kind of really shifted the dynamics in that situation, as people saw kind of the ridiculousness of, playing your NCAA football game with, QB number 0 on the back of the jersey, and being like, well, what exactly is the reason behind that? Oh, it's because they're in legal trouble because of all this, because the players aren't getting paid. That, I think, starts to really kind of shift the public discourse in that area, and kind of make it where maybe changing amateurism a little bit, or taking away amateurism to a certain degree, isn't going to kill college sports.
So we'll get into that next episode. I love it, but we'll wrap this up with our unilateral decision. We'll start with Joe. We'll go around the horn. Obviously, you look at the broadcast rights and the money that's been dumped into these programs. It's fundamentally shifted everything. I think there's distinctive pros and cons to the situation. Let's say you're in charge of everything. You get to make a unilateral decision. Free market economy with broadcast rights. You leave it as is and just let it figure itself out? Or if not, do you make a change? What is it?
Yeah, I'm conflicted. I mean, I really am. The decision led to college athletics, I mean, college football specifically, being one of our nation's greatest pastimes, and it's exploded. But what's transpired over the last few years with conference realignment, I'm not a fan of. So part of me wants to answer the question with, I would rather see conferences pool the revenue together and share, but I know that's never going to happen. So I don't have a good answer. Like, whatever we have to do to bring some sanity back to college athletics from, a geographical perspective, that's my answer. And I'm not smart enough. Maybe Sam can tell me what that answer is, but that's what I would do.
Well, to do it, we would need to change the Sports Broadcasting Act, which is, of course, what Texas Tech Booster and Regents, Board of Regents President Cody Campbell is proposing. And, to have kind of that shared revenue to kind of get around the Regents decision to be allowed to have kind of one broad television deal for the entirety of however you want to define it, whether it be all of Division I or just the Power 4 or just the Power 2, however you want to do it. But, kind of accepting the premise that we're going to be making these unilateral decisions, I think if you look at the NBA, I think you look at the NFL, two most popular sports leagues in the country, if not the world. I guess the Premier League's probably well above that.
It's a very American take.
Yeah, very American take. Immediately took it back. Both of those leagues have shared revenue. Both of those leagues have shared revenue where a team like, the Green Bay Packers, who are in kind of this, little town in the middle of Wisconsin, can compete on the same level as the Dallas Cowboys. And that's like, if you want competitive balance in college sports, you do have to start there, where you have kind of shared revenue, where you don't have situations where solely for market reasons, Rutgers is able to make, magnitudes more television money than a school like Tulane, Boise State, Memphis, et cetera. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to ask, will that actually solve the competitive balance problem? Would that actually solve the geographics? Because it's not even just television revenue. There's a lot of components to revenue, and college sports has one area of revenue that professional sports leagues don't have, which is, of course, booster revenue. And, just the amount of booster support that some schools, especially, the Big Ten and SEC schools that have these giant alumni networks and really well-established alumni networks, would that actually solve the problem? I'm not so sure, but I think it would definitely be a step in the right direction.
In the spirit of the show, I'm going to say no. If you make me czar for the day, you put me in charge of college football, college athletics at large, I don't believe that the SCORE Act and what they've put together to try to amend the Sports Broadcasting Act is the answer. I think that there's some severe irony in the idea that going back to pre-Regents is going to fix the problem. And I think that the concept that you want to centralize power really just further opens you up to the issues around collective bargaining, around employment, around revenue share, as you brought up. And at the end of the day, if you want to fix your actual problem, don't look to this ancillary thing that you can point to that you say, well, if we had that, it would be better. If you had that, you're going to have more of the same problems that you have right now, and they might be exacerbated in a lot of ways because we've already seen it. We saw what the ruling was because of all the other things on the outside. And they're not the NBA right now. They're not the NFL right now. There's some very marked things that are different about the way the NBA operates, the way the NFL operates, and the way college athletics operates. And to pretend that they're the same without fixing those other things first and asking for the same protections that those groups have without the things that those groups do to protect the people that are part of their ecosystem, I think is foolish. And so I think that is not the answer today. It could be the answer after you solve some of the other fundamental issues, but that's not what's going to solve college athletics today. And so I think that it's a good platform to stand on. You get to go talk about it. It's something that you can share with a broader audience, and it's much easier to digest, I think. You can say, look, these other leagues have this protection. We deserve it too. But it's a lot more difficult to have the conversation in the public about the things that those organizations do differently that allow them that opportunity. And so for me, no, I wouldn't chase that dream.
Yeah, and to be clear, I do not think the SCORE Act is the answer either. No, I if we're focusing on that one kind of decision, or focusing on, like, is revenue share something that would help as one component to broader reforms? I think, it definitely could be. But yeah, you are spot on, Mike. There are so many other things that need to be done along with that in order to, fix the problems of college sports.
Mike, you said it and it made me laugh. You mentioned the word issues, a lot of issues. I think the good news for our show, college athletics, full of issues right now. We'll get into modern day ones several episodes from now. Next one, we'll talk the O'Bannon case, video games, one of the best video games of all time. But for our first episode of uNILateral Decisions, for Mike Walsh, Sam Ehrlich, Joe Nickell, we appreciate y'all watching and listening. We'll see you next time.